like how much do I need to cover on all this stuff? I mean, like I have to cover white racial identity now, and I have to cover African Americans, and I have to cover Latinos, and I have to cover Asians, and now I have to cover gay people too? And it's like, well, yeah.
In order for like change to occur in terms of discrimination, people actually have to believe that people are being discriminated against because of these things.
The woman was talking about how in her religion they view homosexuality as an abomination. And the class sort of got quiet, and nobody really knew how to respond to that, including the teacher. I actually had these thoughts going through my head. One of the thoughts was, what this student said was bullshit. And then another thought was, but maybe she's right. I went from being a healthy gay man, as healthy as I can be right now in this climate, to I'm a faggot again. And I'm back in junior high school or elementary school, and I'm trying to walk through a hallway. And I realized that maybe this is what we're talking about when we're working for clients.
The professor asked what kind of factors plays into experiences of people's lives, and somebody said sexual orientation. Then a student said, well, what's with those students in my undergrad who started sleeping with women? And another student said, oh, you mean lipstick lesbians? And another student very quickly said, gays and lesbians I can understand, I guess, but what's with those bisexuals? Do they like men or do they like women? And the professor turned around and said, I don't know. She cut the conversation and discussion off at that point and said, I don't want to get into this any further, and changed the subject.
Well, the task supervisor said that she was a little concerned about the fit with me and the field placement that I had. And she said that the organization that I was working with was really conservative, and she didn't know if I would fit in. The first thing that came to my mind was it was because I was gay and that, that I didn't dress like a girl. My task supervisor was basically like really nervous and upset, and was saying that she had been up all night, she hasn't been able to sleep since I've been there, because this was like a problem for her and something that she's been constantly thinking about, and if she jumping to conclusions by thinking the population wouldn't accept me, and that it wouldn't be appropriate for her to go ask me to buy a whole new wardrobe. Yeah, I wouldn't wear a dress, and besides, my hair would not grow overnight. Like, I remember saying, like, and I'm not going to wear makeup. She just began to say, like, other options, like, either, like, maybe I could stay at the field placement but never go to the meetings, like, work with the population that was in-house, which was not anything what I was supposed to do, and that basically I would just stay and do it, like, work in this building, because nobody in this building would have a problem. It's just when she sent me out to the community, she felt like they would have a problem. She's like, well, how are you feeling? And I was like, I feel like I'm being discriminated against. And she said, don't use that word, discrimination. That's not what's happening here.
And this was an exercise that for people who identified as straight to imagine that they were gay or lesbian. So as I was laying out what to do, one woman said, oh no, I absolutely cannot do that, it's against my religion. And she said, well, I don't mean anybody any harm, but I wasn't raised this way. I was taught that it was wrong. I can't do that. And then another student, in a furious tone, said the NASW Code of Ethics does not allow this. It is not considered professional behavior. It's not okay to discriminate based on sexual orientation. You're not allowed to do it. It's wrong. Can't do it. Get over it. in a way, I tried to normalize it. I tried to say that there are value conflicts, that how we're socialized at times flies in the face of what we as a profession expect, is decent and appropriate. So I get an email from this student who had raised the code of ethics and said, "Why am I allowing homophobia in the classroom?" Tough question. I said, I think we're on the same side here. I agree. I want people to be more open and accessible and supportive of folks. It's not okay. And I don't think you can hit people over the head with it.
So I emailed the teacher and just sort of told her my concerns and told her the journey that I went through. And then next week, we brought it up. And she brought it up too. I think she was very aware of the fact that this was something that we all needed to talk about. But at that moment, we didn't know what to say. And it was actually a good conversation. And I sort of raised my hand and said, when I hear that, you're talking about me. Like, that's me. And you know me to be a fellow student and a colleague and a person that's going to go out there when we graduate and try and do some good things. Ultimately, I think this was a good thing because I saw things change in this class from that conversation. People were able to talk about the things that they're uncomfortable with. People were able to say, hey, you know what, maybe, despite the fact that I've grown up in this religion and I love my religion and I love this expression, maybe there are some things that are wrong. I think that's what a lot of gay people wind up doing, even gay people who stay in the church.
I didn't even know what to say in that meeting. Like, I was almost shaking, and I was like, I don't believe this is happening. Like, I didn't feel like it was an investigation of the agency. I felt like it was an investigation on me and, like, my cultural competency in terms of, like, could I work with this population and would I be effective, So I almost felt worse when I left that meeting. Like, I just remember leaving and crying and, like, going to one of my professors being like, I don't believe what just happened. What was happening in that meeting was people trying to say, well, maybe that wasn't why she got discriminated against. Maybe it was about the dress code or her professionalism. I was also asked at any time, did they say that I couldn't work there because I was a lesbian? Or did they actually say that that was the reason why I couldn't work there? Or that I wouldn't be a good fit? And I said, no, they never said that, but why would they say that? That would be like blatant discrimination.
I went to see the professor, and basically she said, how dare I come to her office and tell her that she had reacted in an inappropriate way, which is not how I had introduced it. I said I am a non-heterosexual, I identify as a lesbian, and I had a problem with what the students had said and how she had reacted to it because I felt that it was reinforcing their beliefs and that there was no further discussion. First of all, she said it did not rise to the level of homophobic comments, and that if I had a problem with that, I must have a hard time getting through life. She also said that sexual orientation was not part of the course, and that she didn't want to get into the subject anyway, and that when it came up, she had no desire because it wasn't on the curriculum, and so she saw no reason in pursuing it, and that's why she shut it down right then.
Some of it's about transphobia, and some of it's just about general insensitivity of what it's like to be somebody who's differently gendered. When I went into Hunter, I was still sort of female identified, but questioning, and people were always calling me he and sort of questioning me about whether I was in the right restroom. So we're not just talking about someone who is deciding to go through a gender transition, but someone who is just being themselves and using the restroom that they feel is the most appropriate restroom at that moment.
It did come up once in our abnormal psych class. We talked about gender identity disorder. It came up only from what is obviously a pathologizing perspective in abnormal psych. After we talked about schizophrenia and depression, anxiety disorders, et cetera, gender identity disorder. In contrast, it wasn't talked about in the as any part of normal variation of human development or anything like that.
In our first interaction, when I met with her, she ran my social security number on the computer. It came up under my birth name, and she looked at me and she's okay, well, Diana, for this particular meeting, I have to refer to you in what's stated on the computer, which is your birth name. And I looked at her saying, like, okay, but it was unpleasant and uncomfortable. Instead of saying, you know what, I know what it says here on the computer, Diana, how would you like for me to refer to you as?
When I took my research methods class, it was very difficult. One of the examples that the professor was constantly using to show sort of like a binary, question example where people would be forced to choose one of the two options was sex and whether somebody was male or female. Each and every time, this one other friend in the class, and we would always raise our hand and say, this is a really inappropriate example. And at the beginning, we just sort of took her aside after class and said, here's the reason why this is an inappropriate example. Actually, people don't always fall into those two gender categories. If you want to use that as an example, at least add, a couple of other gender categories to acknowledge that there are people who, for whom male and female may not be a sort of a flat fit. Mm-hmm. And she was like, oh, okay, I understand. But then she never did anything to change that. And that was really frustrating because then she continued to use that example again and again and again instead of choosing something else. I'm
in a research class right now and we had to do the IRB application and there's a question on the application and it says how many women are going to be in your study and how many men are going to be in your study. And I was just this is really limiting, and especially for the population that I'm working for, I feel like it would totally go against what research I'm doing. And I didn't necessarily think my research professor would say anything, and he's like, wow, I never even really thought. I mean, maybe the fact that he didn't think about it was a problem, but the fact that he was willing to address it with the IRB and really bringing it up, and he's like, this is really serious and we need to talk about this in terms of adding, even if it's transgender or opting as no gender.
He called me back a couple of minutes later and he says, I got clarification and what it is that there is money available for you, but it is only for women. And what they mean by women is that you would need to provide a birth certificate that says female. So I'm thinking, I don't think any female before me has provided a birth certificate that says female.
A fellow student said that, she's trying to raise her son and she would never want her son to be exposed to somebody like that in the world. And, she sort of said that in the classroom right in front of me. And no one in the class came to my defense. The professor didn't come to my defense. I tried to sort of report it as an incident. It never went anywhere.
I think that the institution assumes that because we've chosen this profession, that we are going to come with a higher consciousness about diversity issues and difference.
I came there assuming that I was not going to be the most progressive person, that in fact I would be challenged by others. And I was actually kind of disappointed to find out that the challenge really was that other people had a lot of stereotypes and that it was, then became sort of my role to challenge those stereotypes. Unless you bring it up, it doesn't exist. And that was true in class, and it was true at field.
I took a domestic violence course, and there was nothing on violence in same-sex couples.
I mean, I think that when students tend to bring things up that the professor hasn't initiated, whether it's sexuality, gender, or something totally different, the message that's taken from that is that it's outside of the curriculum. It's outside of what the class is supposed to be about, because if it was something that should be on the agenda, the professor would have brought it up.
A lot of the content that I've had, the LGBT specific content that I've had in my education, has been content that I or my friends have brought into the classroom. So, I did a presentation, a 30-minute presentation on, the special issues related to LGBT seniors for my aging class.
Like, faculty initially used to say, can you come and lecture my human behavior class on homosexuality? And I used to say yes. Now I say no. Let me give you some readings and let me talk to you about what you should do to talk to the class about these topics. Don't bring, the queer professor in, to be the representative on that topic. You need to talk about that topic. And they'd say frequently, well, I don't know anything about it. Read about it.
In my professional life, I have often had to go out and train non-LGBT providers to work with this community. And the problem I find is, and I think this is what I find in school also, is that many people want to label the individual as opposed to allowing the individual to tell them who they are. So those assumptions are the battles we always have to fight, because clinicians, teachers, fellow students often assume that they know who they're talking to, when that is so not the case.
There's another student that came by and said hi to me and was like, oh, I get you guys mixed up. When you look at our physical features, we're not that similar, but we wear baseball caps. We wear, hooded sweatshirt. We dress alike, so then it kind of puts us in that typecast, if all lesbians look the same.
My concern is, though, that there is still a lack of awareness, whether on the part of some professors or in some of the students, about what this community is all about. A case in point is transgender doesn't necessarily mean gay, but that assumption is often made.
There's certain things that, are set up at Columbia that have become institutionalized that people don't give a second thought to. And a lot of it is the restrooms, and a lot of it is the women's locker rooms in the gymnasium, and a lot of it is just the simple fact is, when it asks for your sex on your application, it just says male or female.
I think students are more willing to talk about different experiences than teachers give us credit for.
Let's say, for argument's sake, there's a theory piece that we need to address in a class where you're learning a specific theoretical technique, and maybe discussing how you're using that with clients, but also allowing a piece where you're asking the question, how does who you are affect your interpretation of this? And maybe that would address the diversity piece. I'm lesbian identified, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm also Dominican. What's going to be most significant and come out most in my practice? What's going to influence that the most? So I think if you include that piece, there'd be some rich discussion. And I haven't seen that happen.
I think there were some professors who clearly understood that the people in the classroom already made up a huge, rich diversity of, fodder for the classroom, and others who didn't. So I think that, when those professors valued what each person in the room had to add and say, and like really included them as part of making a dynamic classroom setting, I think it automatically made me feel more comfortable and probably made other people feel more like they could bring themselves into the classroom. It's the kind of field that, how can you not bring yourself into it? And that is part of the expectation, is that you will bring yourself into it. And then the message that trans people and other LGBT people get is, bring this part of yourself into it, but not this part of yourself into it.
So there was a lot of intolerance expressed, and by and large I would say that my professor had no training in how to deal with such dissent. Really harmful views were expressed very freely and openly in the class at all times.
If a discussion begins in a class and like any human being, they know it's not going the right way, they need to stop it, they need to focus what we're doing, and even elicit some, I guess, concrete fact about what we're talking about. I think that's their responsibility. Like, not to edit, but certainly to direct.
And a lot of times people make very racist comments without even realizing it. But I use them as teaching materials, you know, and again, going back to the safe environment, I have to take it to mean that people have been victims of racism before, and they're learning the behavior and they're projecting that kind of values. And I help them understand by asking questions about what really is going on. So I'm not blaming them, but I'm saying, all right, let's look at it. This is a very strong reaction here. Why do you think you have that reaction?
So we were doing this improvisation exercise, a performance of a lifetime. People were being asked to perform, give something of their life in a minute. And different people volunteered to do a performance of their lifetime. And I think about 4 people had performed, and I said, one more volunteer. The class was kind of silent, and somebody said, you do it. So I have a commitment to being willing to kind of, you know, be exposed, look a little foolish. I'm not an actor. I'm not polished in that way, but I thought I'm asking them to do it, and people did it. So they're, okay, so I'll do it. In anybody's life, a zillion things people could give, but I decided to perform 1 minute of my life when I was a kid and I would be mistaken for a boy. This particular person came up to me after and said, did that really happen to you? Like, yeah. And she started to talk about her own experience with that in her life, and kind of it freed her up to be in the class in some different ways.
I think it's not about just delivering a lecture, and I don't see it as that. I see it as a dialogue between the instructor and the students, that you have to have certain connection. In order for that to happen, you have to make the connection with everyone. You can't just stand there and talk.
I would use the teachings of social work as the model for how we would address issues of diversity. We have an ethical responsibility, it's a value of our profession to examine these concerns.
LGBT-sensitive trainings to administrators, to staff, to professors, to faculty, to part-time professors.
Yeah.
I mean, that first and foremost needs to be conducted.
I think that the dilemma or the fault of the profession is we would say to faculty, you have to cover these topics, but we didn't give them any tools on how do you cover those topics. You know, we didn't do any faculty development on how do you include content on GLBTQ populations.
if you're going to place the expectations that I'm putting out, on your faculty and your staff, that they be able to provide appropriate education and include issues around people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, then you have to provide them with the support and the opportunity to discuss the issues that are coming up for them.
But what does it mean for us to deal with what gets raised for us in going some places with students? Because our own stuff gets exposed too. And we have to be willing to say, oh, I just said that? Oh, yeah.
When administration sends out a message that, this is required and you have to do it, especially when it comes to, changing your values and looking at yourself, it never quite works because then people already become defensive and resistant. I would just actually organize more, let's say, get together between students and faculty. If you have more interaction between students and faculty, and let the faculty hear from the students about, well, there were times that they feel, not validated, that there were times they don't feel safe in the classroom. It may be an eye-opening experience for the faculty.
There is this, opportunity throughout social work education, all the way from classroom work to field work to, postgraduate education, whether it's through SIFI or other kinds of workshops that happen, to really change the tone of what's happening. And it's not taken advantage of at all. It's just not, people are not taking that opportunity to identify these schools as agents of social change.